The thing that's somewhat saddening about the GB story is that it didn't end well. The Granville brothers built several versions of the GBZ, the GBR1, the GBR2. They even built a hybrid version called the GBR1R2. It was a kind of a lengthened version of the GB. And they met with a lot of catastrophe in the very short history that these racing planes were in the racing circuit. None of them were really caused by the design of the aircraft. It wasn't really the fault of the airplane. It was the fault of the pilot flying it. These airplanes demanded things from pilots that had never experienced those kinds of flight demands before. There was no airplane on Earth like the GB. So people that were getting into it had 30, 40, 50 hours of flight time. That's not enough experience to get into an airplane this demanding and go out and fly it in every flight attitude. The other thing that they were doing wrong back in the 30s was they were oftentimes flying the airplane with the center of gravity too far aft, too far towards the tail. Because again, completely new design. It'd be like us being put into an aircraft that nobody on Earth has ever flown before. Who would know how to balance it and set it up for a proper flight? You know, there might be a few crashes before you figured it out. Well, that's what happened to the Granvilles. But remember, this was happening in the height of the Depression, so they couldn't survive that kind of catastrophe. So the business went under after a short while, and the Granville brothers, the family of the Granville brothers, never released the plans for this aircraft if someone was going to build a flying replica. If you told the Granvilles you wanted the plans because you were going to build a replica, it was okay as long as it was not going to be a flying replica. Well, back in the 90s, the early 90s, Steve Wolf and Delmar Benjamin got together and they decided that they wanted to build a flying replica of the GBR2. They couldn't acquire the plans from the family because of what I just mentioned. So they went to many of the non-flying replicas at museums around the country, and from those full-scale exhibits, they drew up their own set of plans. They also met with the designer, Howell Miller, and a number of GB experts like Henry Hafke and Vern Clements, and they drew up the most accurate set of plans they could for a full-scale R2 replica. They built it over the course of about 13 months, and Delmar Benjamin flew that airplane for many years on the air show circuit. And if you've seen it fly, there's no overt indication that Delmar's fighting the airplane. I was somewhat of a GB groupie. I went to many air shows where he flew the airplane because I was so fascinated with it. And I would, at every opportunity, I would talk to Delmar. I talked to him at Oshkosh in 1998. Actually got to have a piece of 1,000-hour cake with Delmar. They were celebrating 1,000 hours of flight time in the GB. I happened to be there at Oshkosh in 98. Every time I had an opportunity to talk to him about the GB, he would tell me that the reputation of this airplane was well-deserved. He was just a superb pilot. That was the second half of the sentence he wouldn't fill in. You had to fill in the blanks yourself. Well, obviously, he was a superb pilot. He had many, many hours in the GB. I think about 1,500 all told before he retired the airplane. And there was talk of it being ensconced in the Smithsonian. I think at some point, some of the curators of the Smithsonian said, we can't put the GB in the Smithsonian because it's not an original. They try to have original aircraft in the Smithsonian. So he ended up selling the airplane to Kermit Weeks, who owns Fantasy of Flight in Florida. So you can actually go and see Delmar's GBR2 replica at Fantasy of Flight Museum in Florida. I've actually been there and seen the aircraft. It's not flying currently. It is still flyable. It would need probably some serious maintenance to get it in the air. Also, the airstrip at Fantasy of Flight is not long enough to land the aircraft. So I don't believe Kermit Weeks, if he ever just decides to fly it, will fly it from that airstrip.